This is Jeff Thompson, Tomo. If not the fastest bowler purely on pace, then surely the quickest when you compare his bowling to anyone else of his era compared to any other bowler ever. Essentially, he was a lot faster than anyone else when he bowled. People were terrified to face him. But I want you to look at something else here. Let's just rewind this ball and stop right here. Do you see it? The field. He has a short leg and a leg slip, but also a full slip cordon. That means that while 2 are set for the short ball, 4 others are in far more conventional positions. There would probably also be a fine leg, maybe a square leg as well. And this isn't the only Tomo field that I checked. You can see that for this one he has 2 catches on the leg side, which was fairly common for him. Tomo was so super quick that he didn't ever need many players in front of square, but he almost always had full slip cordons with catches for the fend-off. Let's change the subject to one of the other most famous bouncer spells of all time, Michael Holding to Brian Close. In this spell, Close took an extraordinary amount of punishment and the field was fairly normal. Slip cordon with 2 catches on the leg side again. Not that you need any fielders at all if this is what you're going to do with the ball. The only way Close was clearing this field was with his nose. And finally, we have Alan Donald almost ending Mike Atherton. Look at this stacked offside field here. Again, pretty conventional, but with a fielder at short leg. When Atherton had the audacity to hook, you could see that a fielder at square leg was running off after the ball. There is no second fielder out on the boundary. This is how bouncer spells used to look. Now, it's more like this. The fielders are spread everywhere. This no longer looks like any kind of proper cricket field that we grew up with. You don't find this in any coaching books. I mean, the only reason you would need a field like this for Mike Atherton would be for comedy effect. Almost every batter at Lord's had a field set like this for them. And that is because it was the most bouncers ever recorded in Test cricket history. Of course, that only really counts the ball by ball error. And I should also note that you might see different numbers because everyone counts these their own way. But this test match was number 1 no matter what distance you were looking at for your bouncers. And not by a little bit either. These 2 teams smashed the previous world record. We have never seen a test like this before. And this just showed us again that Test cricket looks different now. And the question is, why? What if I told you the most influential Test cricketer in the world was a fast medium left-arm bowler who had to leave his own country because he couldn't even break into the major part of first-class cricket? Yes, of course. Again, I am talking about Neil Wagner. And I know what you're thinking. What about Virat Kohli, who by stating that he regularly wanted to play Test cricket, maybe made a huge impact on the future of the sport? But he didn't change the way that the game was played. What about Steve Smith, perhaps? You could make an argument that he is the greatest batter since Bradman. But so far, we haven't really seen any real clones to try his method. Although some players did start batting on off stump after his success, but it didn't really work that well for anyone else. Jimmy Anderson was the man who gave the world the wobble ball. Not the inventor, that was Muhammad Asif. But Anderson was the reason it spread around the world. But of course, TV also played a part in that. We have better cameras now, so people were picking it up just by watching. Who else do we have on this list? What about the 4 all-rounders? Shakib Al Hasan, Jason Holder, Ravi Jadeja, and Ben Stokes. But as important as they have been, sure, you can try someone as an all-rounder because it has worked for them, but in truth, you either have someone who can do that role, or you don't. I suppose if you factor in also Ben Stokes as a captain, that would be another part for him. However, as it currently stands, while there has been a slight bump to run rates in Test cricket, teams aren't really bazballing outside of England, although it is still very early on. So even if you think one of these players is more influential than Neil Wagner, that he is on this list at all is incredible. That field that we showed you before, I would call this the Wagner effect. He was the first player who did this less than just as a one-off, and more as a full-time career. His cordon was 3 catches on the leg side, or 3 sweepers out on the boundary, who in his case were also catchers. And his fields certainly had a huge effect on that side of cricket, even if each captain puts their own individual spin on it. And what about the amount of bouncers? Well, they had actually gone down of recent times, but that makes sense as that was during the pace-playing pandemic, or the wobble ball era. Batters were going out so quickly, you didn't need bouncers. But look at this year. This is a substantial rise, and it's the highest in this database. As batters have evolved to handle the wobbling seam, bowlers have gone back to bouncers. But Wagner has so many different kinds of effects on cricket, like the accuracy of his bouncers. This was something that Curtly Ambrose and Courtney Walsh were very good at, making sure that each short ball counted. But bowlers in general have never been that accurate when delivering short stuff. However, Wagner was as accurate with his bouncer as Vernon Philander was on a length. And if you notice this Lord's Test, despite the incredible amount of bounces that were bowled, they weren't as accurate as Wagner, but they were pretty spot on. But another thing that Wagner has brought in is the difference in speed. The idea in the old days that bounces were bowled by your quickest bowlers. Neil Wagner was never the fastest bowler that New Zealand had. He was never slow, but they always had quicker options. So when you see England using even slower bowlers than him, that is where the idea comes from. Fitness is another part. The stories on Wagner's fitness are legendary. We all know about that time he bowled a 10-over bouncer spell up a hill into a wind, carrying a piano on his back. But the base fitness levels of all Test cricketers has improved so much. The professionalism of cricket certainly plays a large part here, because bowling long bouncer spells is far more draining than regular type of bowling. The other thing that has changed, which is slightly less to do with Wagner, is analytics. We always knew that the pull and the hook shots were the riskiest shots played in cricket, because they are not using the full face of the bat. You are swinging across the ball, and you're often doing it off your nipples or eyeballs while turning your head. But that is very different from someone coming in and saying that 3 of the 5 most likely attacking shots that you will be dismissed by are all from bouncers. It's only one delivery, but it brings about so much extra risk from any batter who is trying to score off it. And let's just zoom in here, enhance, and take a real good look. The leave averages almost as much as the hook. There was no way we would ever know that before ball-by-ball tracking. And analytics make sports go to the extreme. If you read Kurt Goldsberry's books, you will see how the NBA went to 3-pointers. If you look every year on the NBA, you can see over the years that the more information the players had about the shot that was the riskiest, that paid the most, the more they shot it, which makes sense. And in discussing this, Goldsberry's warning to the sport is that something needs to be done, or that basketball will mostly be 3-pointers into the future. But there is something else here, because outside of the dunk, the 3-pointer is the most exciting shot in basketball. But they are not as exciting when they miss. And they miss around 2/3 of the time. So right now, basketball fans see better shooting than they've ever seen before, and yet more misses. For cricket, the successful Yorker is probably the most exciting, but it's quickly followed, yes, pun intended, by the bouncer. That ball is visceral and brutal. The phrase about it is, smell the leather. It's basically cricket at its darkest and most wild. But when you have seen 500 of them in one test, many delivered around the pedestrian 80 miles per hour mark, they are no longer anything like that. They just become another normal delivery after a while. And that on its own is not terrible. White ball cricket has meant that most Yorkers are fairly pedestrian as well. But the point is, if everyone starts to bowl bouncers like this, they just will become less exciting. Of course, Ben Stokes has already said that this pitch was a bit of a one-off. It was a little bit too paced with the short ball, perhaps making it a perfect storm. We'd already seen England go towards bouncers for long periods of times before, and Australia doesn't really need to be encouraged with that when they have so many quick bowlers. We also know that England specifically will continue to bowl bouncers, but that it won't always work. Part of the reason just is the pitches, right? Let's go to the map. We already know that this bouncer theory won't work on most wickets in Asia. There just isn't the bounce. So that is already a big part of the cricket world that just won't be able to do this. I'm also a little bit skeptical of it working in South Africa or Australia, just because of the extra pace and carry means that you could score so quick off those shots and clear so many boundaries. That's not to say it won't work, but it might be even riskier for the bowling team. The places that it makes the most sense for me are England, the West Indies, Zimbabwe, Ireland, and New Zealand. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Wagner started his theory in New Zealand and not South Africa. But even within all these different locations, you still need the right kind of wickets to help this theory. So it might actually end up only a fairly small amount of tests where this happens. And there are other reasons why this won't work all the times. Teams will sometimes just score quick off it. That is what happens on occasions when you bowl a lot of bouncers. The good shots go for runs, and even the bad shots go for runs. And sometimes you get 4 byes or 5 wides as well. These are fast scoring shots, and some days they will spook bowling teams. Also, bowling a lot of bouncers is really tiring. Just bowling fast is tough. Bowling bouncers takes even more out of you. And this is twofold. At first, you have to ask yourself, is it worth you putting your best bowlers through 5 to 10% more effort for a couple of extra wickets? Especially with any team, it's never going to create more than 5 or 6 test quality bowlers at any time. And then you have to factor in that Test cricket just has so many back-to-back schedules now. You would have to track how bowlers do in the second matches to see if this is even worth it in the first place. The other interesting part for me is if batters start to leave the ball more often. Just take a few on the body, get their duck back on. It's not been as much of a skill in modern cricket. 2 hours of bouncers in the middle session, which is where I expect to see this tactic used the most, could be thwarted by giving that session up and just not playing the pull or hook shot. See if you could just tire the opposition out even if you only score 30 runs. And because we're going to talk about bouncers so much, you might have heard me say before that this was the most bouncers ever bowled in a game. I'm pretty sure this is true. But in order to prove that, we have to talk about bodyline. Because quite clearly, there were big long spells of short bowls bowled in that series. But the important thing to note is it was only by 1 or 2 bowlers. And even then, mostly Harold Larwood. You could see that Bill Vose didn't actually bowl that much in the series. And outside of Larwood and Vose, you had Gubby Allen, who was playing for England, who refused to bowl in that style. Wally Hammond bowled a little bit of medium pace, and Headley Verity was their spinner. Also, we're just talking about England so far. Australia didn't retaliate with their own version of bodyline bowling. So while in that series there were a lot more bouncers bowled than had ever been bowled before in Test cricket. By today's standards, it was probably maybe slightly on the high side, but nowhere near the top. What was really different about bodyline, of course, was the fields. So this is a normal field that you saw on bodyline. You can see a stacked slips cordon and then some ring fielders on the offside. Whereas this is anything but a normal field. Let us enhance this and you can see just how weird it is. There is a leg slip, a leg gully, a short backward leg, and a short leg. I've never said leg so much in my life. Now let's have a look at another field, because this one is even more extraordinary. So let's have a look. Shall we count the fielders here? I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Is that right? 6 catches in close on the leg side. And if you are having trouble visualizing this field from the still image, I think this is more or less what it would have looked like. And you can see I've got a fielder out here near point. I'm not even sure if they did have a fielder out in that position or if there wasn't someone else extra on the leg side boundary. So here you have the bodyline field and the Lord's Wagner field. You can see how different they are to each other. But there is a very obvious reason why they're different, because during bodyline there was no limit on the amount of fielders behind square on the leg side. So this field map on the left would no longer be legal in modern cricket. And most people think that bodyline actually changed that law. But it was over 20 years later when they finally changed it. And bodyline certainly played a part, but it was also because off-spinners were bowling to defensive boring fields. But if you're still thinking that there was a lot of bouncers bowled in bodyline, I just want to note something else. Remember this ball I showed you before? Let us just rewind it and have another look. Where is this ball pitched? Very full. So much so that it is driven down the ground. Remember, in this Lord's match, England basically didn't bowl a full ball in an entire session. This is clearly not the case with bodyline. Even when they had their fields completely set for the short pitch bowling, they still occasionally went full. So I think we could say that bodyline was extreme for its day, but nothing like this Lord's test. So the other obvious one is the West Indies in the 80s and 90s. This is a team that actually did change the length of bowling all around the world, from full and swinging to back of a length and seaming. So we know they bowled shorter than everyone else, and of course there were plenty of bouncers. But the more you dig into it, the more obvious it is that while they bowled a lot of bouncers, it was nothing like this Lord's Test match. The most famous game for the West Indies and bouncers is probably the Test in 1986. That is when everyone decided it was the most short balls they'd seen. Sadly, no footage remains of this game. But Rob Smythe wrote a great story on it, having talked to all the people who were there, and we also do have the scorecard. There's no doubt in this match that lots of people got hit, and the pitch was clearly not great. Plus, Patrick Patterson bowled probably as fast as he ever had. But we also know that not as many of these balls were actual bouncers, and that's because we can read from some of the reports at the time. For instance, John Woodcock wrote that both of them sometimes attempted 6 bounces in an over. Think about that. In this last test, we saw that over after over after over after over. It wouldn't even occur to us to write that down as a note. Almost every over was 6 attempted bounces. But you also had the English fast bowler Greg Thomas saying that the wicket actually made a lot of the balls in that game look like they were bouncers when they weren't. The other thing worth remembering is the West Indians were so alien compared to all other bowling around the world at that time that when they bowled back of a length, it often felt a lot shorter and faster than everywhere else. And there are many different factors here. Racism in the reporting played a big part. The fact that it was the first proper 4-man pace attack we'd ever had. The West Indies had a lot of tall bowlers who got extra bounce out of the wicket. And they were already bowling a different length than anyone else ever had. So many of their deliveries were rising up at the chest, and they were doing it in unison. And because there were 4 of them, they were almost causing a cricket version of the cheerleader or fireman effect. So the West Indies definitely changed how we bowled seam in tests, and they hit a lot of players along the road. But their bouncers were there to set up for a full ball. Like I was just talking about that Sabina Park game and how famous it was for their brutal bowling. But look at the scorecard. In the first innings, there were 3 bowls or LBWs in there. In the second innings, they got 6 of them. That's almost half the wickets that they got in that game were from bowled or LBWs. I'm not saying they didn't bowl a lot of bouncers. I'm saying they didn't bowl anywhere near as Lord's 23 level of bouncers. Because in this particular game, there was little setting you up for a full ball. There was just another bouncer, and occasionally a back of a length ball if you were lucky. So I would be shocked if any match before ball-by-ball tracking came in anywhere near the amount of bouncers that this one had. But luckily for us, Neil Wagner does live in the ball-by-ball era, which means that we could even look at him compared to other players. This is a list of the matches with the most bouncers ever. The games in pink are the ones that Wagner played in. This is all the games with more than 100 bouncers bowled in them. The far left is obviously Lord's. See the pink streaks? That is Neil Wagner on his own. Christchurch 2016 against the Australians, Wagner bowled as many bouncers, 33rd most ever recorded by two teams in a test match. He almost crossed 200. When you compare him to the rest of cricket, you see that he has bounced all of cricket out. He is the bounciest bowler who ever bounced. But this is just a list of the most bouncers delivered since 2014. Wagner has nearly 1,000 more than second place. But second is interesting because that is Mitchell Starc. Third is Ben Stokes. Fourth is Pat Cummins. Sixth is Josh Hazlewood. Seventh is Stuart Broad. And a long way down the list you can also find Jimmy Anderson. So in terms of bouncers, there are a lot of bowlers in this game that use them a lot. But obviously not on the Wagner level. And one last thing worth showing is the most bouncers bowled by a player in a match. The pink is still Wagner, but the blue is from players in this Lord's 23 test. This is a lot of streaks of blue in one game. And Hazlewood is not on here because I cut this off at 50 bounces and he only delivered 49. But they're all still a mile off Wagner, who obviously in that 2016 game bowled 38% of the bounces that all these different guys combined for at Lord's. But you might be asking, when did Neil Wagner start bowling bouncers? That's February of 2014 when he was playing against India at Auckland and he decided to bowl a lot of short stuff and then never darkened the normal corridor again. Would you like to know who the New Zealand captain was at that time? Nah, I think you already know. It is so obvious I barely need to mention it. While Wagner can lay claim to being the most influential of the current day players, Brendan McCullum has basically been the leading man in all of modern cricket for a long time. His resume includes an opening night IPL 100, inspiring England's white ball cricket by just being better than them, attacking like a maniac in tests. He was the father of New Zealand's greatest period, Bazball. He named a famous former player about match fixing, and he let Neil Wagner bowl bouncers. In a 15-year period, has anyone ever had this much influence on the game? And while many of these things are positive, maybe the bouncers are not. It could actually end up making cricket less enjoyable to watch. And I've been wondering about this quite a lot. I even asked people on my Discord channel about it. Is this game just an anomaly? Or is it the canary in the coal mine that changes cricket forever? The last time I felt like this about one particular game, it was probably the One Day International where Australia and South Africa both passed 400 for the first and I suppose second time. The last time I felt like this about a game, it was the ODI between Australia and South Africa, where Australia was the first team to pass 400 and South Africa was the second team to pass 400. That match was in 2006 and we still talk about it now. But the year before that happened was actually the first time that teams scored at more than 5 runs and over in One Day Internationals. And really, we knew all along that teams were just going to score quicker. The run fest at Wanderers just woke people up who weren't paying that much attention. And I wonder if that's what this match is at Lord's. From World War II until now, we've been seeing more bouncers. But often it's just been little bit by little bit, like the boiling frog experiment. We've been seeing a small rise in bouncers every now and again for so long that we have barely noticed that our game has completely changed. This test at Lord's, that frog finally got bounced out of the pot. Welcome to the Wagnerverse.